If you were to walk outside the museum right now, the first thing made out of iron you would probably see would either be a car or a bus, right? Or a manhole cover. But there'd be a lot more of it around that you weren't seeing.
Edward Hunter is a conservator and armorer in the Arms and Armor Department at the Met. That's right. The Met has an armorer on staff. And we're not outside looking at manhole covers or steel girders. We're deep in the basement of the museum, in a space that reminds me of Belle's father's laboratory and Beauty and the Beast.
All right, so right now you're in the Arms and Armor lab. So, that's hot. Let's not get close to that.
Ted's doing some show and tell for us. Right now, he's hammering a steel rod into a very hypothetical wall mount for a piece of armor.
This is probably not the piece of metal I would necessarily use for that, but I thought it'd be fun to hit this one with a hammer and you could watch, so.
When we were bouncing around materials for the show, iron, mercury, silver, one thing that kept coming up was alchemy. The word conjures up mental images of alchemists hunched over workbenches by candlelight, trying to turn lead into gold. Unlike paper or even concrete, metal is not democratic. It's usually tightly controlled by a ruling elite. And because of that, it's a raw material that's often out of reach to the average person, or else its toxins are all too close. But for those who work with it, there's also a way that metal allows you to dream things into being.
When you can make a blade out of metal in the shape that you want, because you think of the shape, you make a mold that has that shape, and then you fill it with the metal that, like water, takes the form that you have thought, that you have conceived.
That's Marco Leona, who leads the Met's scientific research department. He's got a great title, Scientist in Charge. He'll be our guide through the periodic table. The 7 metals of alchemy are lead, tin, iron, copper, mercury, silver, and gold. Some of these play well together. Copper and tin create bronze. Others, like mercury, attack most of what they touch. But there's magic in metals' bonds and corrosions. And the stories of how each metal's magic works in our world are interrelated. For the Metropolitan Museum of Art, I'm Camille Dungy. This is Immaterial. This episode, we'll talk about iron, tin, lead, and copper, the more sociable metals. When we asked Marco to pick his favorite metal, he named one that combines easily with others.
Iron is an equalizer. Every technology can be mastered by the oppressed and turned against the oppressor very quickly. The nomads of northern Central Europe were able to overtake the Roman Empire chiefly because of 2 tools that the Romans had used to first colonize them. Iron technology that allowed every soldier to have a very high-performing weapon because iron is cheap. And 2, roads, which allow large number of soldiers to move and be resupplied after long marches.
Those concrete roads carried iron weapons and silver coins in the pockets of Roman soldiers. And all those things were made somewhere. Many of them started life in a forge. Back in the basement armory, there's metal everywhere. Cabinets full of different sized scraps. Drawers with labels like tools of unusual purpose or science. There are rows of hammers and some gigantic, functional, antique shears hanging on the wall.
They're not decorative, no. They're sharp, too. and surprisingly fine control for such a humongous shear. I've actually, just as a demonstration for like school kids when they come in here, I'll use the tiny one to just trim my fingernail, and they're all like, don't cut off your finger. I'm like, no, don't worry, snip,
Ted is clearly having a fantastic time in the lab.
There's 14,000 objects made from all kinds of different materials: iron, steel, bronze, brass, copper, gold, silver, bone, horn, leather, shell, wood, ivory, feathers, glass, ceramics, stone. We got paper. We have 5 paintings in our collection. We got a little bit of everything, and I have to take care of all of it.
Understandably, when working on centuries-old helmets and shields, you have to be really excited about detail. Ted opens some of those clearly labeled drawers.
Up behind all this, and we also have then here like just a huge collection of rivets, different sizes. Here, these are my favorites.
Right now, Ted's working on portions of a stunning 16th century armor for a show at the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna, Austria.
I think the title of which is Iron Men, but not like Tony Stark Iron Man.
Though, honestly, the armor in Ted's lab is as marvelous as any of Tony Stark's inventions. A lot of the time, like when Ted mentioned cars and buses earlier, we're not just talking about iron, but one of its alloys, steel. That's true of a lot of the pieces in the Vienna exhibit, which showcases armor from the European Renaissance. The piece Ted's holding up is a disembodied silver and gold arm that mimics the gathering and ballooning of a male courtier's sleeve.
And so if you come over here, you can hear what it sounds like when I pick it up. This is the movement of the armor. It's, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6,
11 segmented steel plates on each arm. And that's before you get into the back plate or down to the molded piece called the rump defense, which protects what it sounds like. It's unlikely that this highly decorative armor would have been worn in battle. This gorgeous hunk of metal was made to be seen. Clothing styles at the time used wide arrays of textures and designs and fabrics, so a lot of variety could be shown off in one garment. And the same is true for this metal armor.
You see how it sort of billows and drapes, but that's all just separate pieces of steel. And then in the fabric, what you'd have done is it had been made out of multiple layers, and then they would cut through the outer layer to reveal the slashes would reveal the inner layer. So in this case, what they've done is they've embossed the steel and to be a slight recess, and then gilt that recess to look like that inner layer of fabric.
In the same way you would use a mannequin to show off a suit of clothes today, Ted is building a custom form that will stand in for the man who wore this lavish armor in 1525. Every single piece in the Arms and Armor collection requires this kind of individual attention.
No offense to my colleagues in the paintings department, right? But hanging a painting on the wall is more or less the same wherever you go. Hang it on the wall. Hanging a pistol on the wall is unique for every pistol. Hanging a helmet, mounting an armor, it's different every time.
Another difference is that you might expect to see paintings at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. But why does the museum have an Arms and Armor department at all?
People think of art as a painting, a sculpture, things like that. But I think they wouldn't even think twice about walking through a gallery that was full of beautiful furniture and ceramics. But you don't need to carve a chair to be able to sit in it, right? You don't need to paint the picture of Aphrodite at the well on the side of an amphora to keep oil in it, right? It's a natural desire of people, of craftsmen, of artists to want to take common, everyday, ordinary things and make them beautiful in some way, right? So the same thing is true of most of our collection. It becomes an expression of style, an expression of power, of wealth, of rank. And between that wearer and the raw ore, there's an artist who's making something. You don't need to put gold inlay or, etch the Virgin Mary on the chest of your armor to protect you from a sword blow. But when you're Emperor Ferdinand, you want a fancy armor.
But in this instance, is the desire for style and the expression of power inextricably linked to the brutality of war?
I think it is fair to say that there have been a lot of technological advances that come around as a result of conflict. It's true. I want to say that's not the only thing that generates technological advancement. Striving for something, I think, is what generates change.
Metals themselves are about making change, creating something new, sometimes almost magically, in the way that adding just a tiny bit of carbon turns iron into shiny, silver-colored steel. The material is capable of some striking transformations, not just swords into plowshares, but metal plates into fabric light as air. It's a conjuring trick Renaissance alchemists might have recognized just as easily as those armorers did, a way to bend reality and reshape the world in our own image. Ted says that when he hears a bus rattling along above the subway platform, he thinks about the iron that holds New York City together. A piece of that New York City history lives inside the Met, not on display behind glass, but in the form of an anvil Ted uses to shape steel.
This was made in Brooklyn. I think it was 1908, at a time when there were still a lot of horses in the city and all kinds of manufacturing. At one point, New York City was the #1 manufacturing center of the world. All those people needed tools. So tools were made in New York City, including big, humongous anvils like this one, which is like a 350-pound anvil mounted on a block of wood that's at least as old as this anvil. Might be older, I don't know. But the tree itself had to have been 100 years old when it was cut. So I'm looking at 200 years of wood here with this 350-pound iron, solid steel anvil on top, made here in New York City. And it's been sitting here in this room now close to 70 years. And I hit it with a hammer all the time.
Metal can be magical, dangerous, violent, artistic, and a source of satisfaction.
Yeah. Down here in the basement, it's on a Friday, it's me and the anvil.
The story of metals, how we find them, how we forge them, and what happens next, is the story of human striving. Sometimes metals show up in armor and anvils, the heavy tools of industry and empire. But metal can also help us forge a path to the divine. Tin is a social butterfly that likes to pull a disappearing act. It's almost never found alone in nature because it loves to form alloys. And perhaps its most famous collaboration is with copper. Together, tin and copper enabled a 2,000-year period called the Bronze Age. Different amounts of tin in the mix would determine the use of the alloy. Low tin bronze was easy to cast and made great tools and weapons. Bulk up its presence and make high tin bronze? Now you could start to make music.
You can imagine that people would see that as, we'd say, an art, but also a little bit of magic, right? You are infusing life to something that could be otherwise lifeless. Being able to put the right amount of tin in the alloy so that the bell that you create with that metal has a clear ring.
There was a time when bronze was the primary metal used in ancient China. As scientist Marco Leona suggested, the addition of tin poured life into many objects. Bronze was used to make mirrors, masks, and vessels. And it was used to make bells.
These bells, in terms of its significance and in terms of its importance, it was not any less than the terracotta army, even though it may not have been as well known. This one tells us so much about the music in ancient China.
That's Jason Soon, curator of Chinese art at the Met, and he's talking about a secret buried in a long, forgotten tomb.
These bells were very different from the bell that we usually see, here around us. These bells have a very different shape. The cross-section of the bells are in the shape of an almond or like an eye. And it's because it's a very peculiar feature. These bells, each one of them can play two tones instead of one. So if you strike on the center of that curving side of the bell, it produces one sound. And if you strike on the side of the bell, then it will be a different tone. Usually it's about a minor second or minor third higher.
The Terracotta Army, as you may know, is a group of thousands of clay soldiers buried with the first emperor of China. As far back as the Zhou dynasty in the 10th century BCE, bells like the ones Jason describes had been placed in the tombs of rulers too. By the 5th century BCE, the bells in each tomb numbered in the teens. Since you could get two tones out of each bell, you didn't need many to make a small orchestra. But then one day, archaeologists discovered that someone had built a symphony.
Many tombs were looted not long after they were buried. The amazing thing about this discovery is that this king, he had 65 bells in a set. It was and still is an extremely elaborate set of bells. I think according to the report of the discovery, it can produce like 5 octaves. Unfortunately, we don't have any recordings surviving from that period of time.
So we can't play you any chamber music from 433 BCE. But the wild thing about this orchestra is that it existed at all. The set of bells Jason is describing is called a bianzhong. 4 figures hold up 3 levels of perpendicular, sturdy, carved wooden beams that reach toward the sky. Remember that metal in this period of time is expensive. It's prestigious. Collectively, this is still the single heaviest musical instrument in the world. And it all belonged to a guy who hadn't seemed particularly important to historians or scholars.
His name was Marquis Yi of the Zheng state. We knew very little about this king before the discovery. And the name of the state was not even quite recorded in China's historical documents. It was a very small state at a time when China was ruled by many different kingdoms. But so far as archaeology is concerned, there isn't anything found from other states about music instruments as large or as sophisticated and as extensive as his treasure.
There was an unreal amount of technology that went into creating these objects. For example, to tune them after they were cast, bell makers would file away at the bronze on the inside until they were the perfect pitch. The discovery of the Marquis' tomb has helped researchers understand how the knowledge of bell making morphed as it traveled through China. Early examples were found in both northern and southern China, but over time, bell craft became more developed and complex in the south.
And the bells in that area along the Yangtze River started to grow bigger in size. I think the largest one I remember when I was visiting the museum in Hunan province, that's about 4 feet tall. It's quite a hefty piece. And that one, well, I didn't try to raise it because it's totally impossible. I think that one is about 500 pounds. That's a lot of metal.
The Met has several bells similar to the Marquis' collection. They're called zhong. These are tall, broad bells with beautifully carved designs and 36 studs placed around the body in 4 groups of 9. The studs help shape the bell's distinctive tone.
Primary tone. Here is the secondary tone.
You're hearing a bell that hasn't rung in 100 years. And no one was sure how that would go. Even in the armory, museums don't make a habit of hitting 2,000-year-old objects with a mallet. There was a possibility that the bells could crack from microfractures, and no guarantees on how they would sound after all this time.
Okay, tell me about this one. Well, this is the 5th century BC original.
With a conservator watching nervously and a curatorial colleague who came along for the occasion, Jason walked my producer Ajwa through what she was looking at and hearing.
Yes, this one is just a smaller version, so it will be a different pitch. So the primary tone, the secondary tone. So you could see the interval is a little larger. Yeah, it's because the size of the bell is smaller. Yeah.
Oh, I see. Could you?
We can do it one more time. That one was supposed to be suspended from a loop. It has a loop or ring on the handle, and that one would be hung on a rack. They always come in a set.
The tomb of the Marquis was flooded sometime after he was buried, which helped preserve it, almost like a shipwreck. So that symphony orchestra of bells was in amazing condition. When archaeologists opened it up, the bells were still hanging patiently on their lacquered wooden frame. There were thousands of objects in his tomb, including many other musical instruments. But let's be real.
He probably had the most bells. He was a bell man.
In the Marquis' day, these were not bells that would have been played for the likes of podcast producers or even museum curators.
The bells were not used for entertainment. It was really a demonstration of your power. When you perform all the rituals, you were not talking to the ordinary people. In a way, I think these elites were communicating with the deities in heaven, with the spirit of the ancestors in heaven.
So you've heard some of this music now. Music that was originally reserved for elites who could talk to the gods. But the bell you heard at the start of this segment, that one is a fake.
The 19th century forgery that came into the museum collection, and I don't know, I think at the time it was probably acquired as a real piece. That one came in 1913. That's 100 years before now. And that was before modern archaeology ever took place in China. Modern archaeology started in China in the late 1920s and early 30s.
Museums and forgeries are a touchy subject, to say the least. This bell is cute. It's small and green like its authentic neighbors, although what looks like patina is actually paint. It has a nice tone. It doesn't look that out of place with the other bells in the study room. But after it was exposed as a fraud, why has the museum held on to it? Jason says that instead of being an embarrassment, the forgery simply shows us how much we still have to learn.
Archaeology in China is developing rapidly. It moves really very fast. I wouldn't say it updates our knowledge on a daily basis, but probably on a weekly basis. There were so many things that we did not know before, and there are many things that we never thought would have existed in China. But now with archaeology, it keeps just amazing us, if not shocking us. For example, before the Terracotta Army was discovered, we had no knowledge of the Terracotta Army. I think there were maybe 7,000 or 8,000 of them. But we never knew because they were never recorded in historical documents. No one even talked about it.
That floored me. 8,000 terracotta soldiers, each one full-sized. Horses, chariots, and other non-military figures, including officials and even acrobats, and just nobody mentioned it anywhere. So I love to think about this music aficionado, the bellman, sitting quietly in his kingdom in an obscure part of ancient China with this enormous collection of bronze bells. Bells that wouldn't be discovered again for centuries. Picture the Marquis, dreaming of music that could speak to the gods, never knowing that thousands of years later, his bells would make him something of an immortal himself. When we get back, we'll hear more about how metals can immortalize us after we are gone. We just learned that you can use tin to give a bell a voice. And tin is not working alone.
Of course, it also have a little lead. And the lead in this case is not only help the metal to flow when you pour the molten metal into the mold. According to the research, this lead also dampens the unwanted overtones. For these bells, you don't want the bell to have a very long-lasting sound. When you play a tune, you want that note would stop at a certain time. Otherwise, you would get a very muddy music. So the lead would help us to dampen the overtone, so the sound wouldn't extend for too long.
Lead is heavy.
Marco Leona again.
So heavy as an atom that it will stop most radiation. X-rays don't go through lead, which makes it very useful.
Useful to a chemist and useful to a bell maker to dampen sound. But you can hear in our language what we think of lead. If something is leaden, it is dull, slow, mournful, a dark sky.
The aspect of gloom. In Italian, coming from the Latin, the word for a gloomy sky is cielo plumbeo. A sky made of lead. Plumbeo is the Latin of lead. But lead too has a vitality that is often not recognized, and a nobility that is often not recognized. It's easy to form, it's easy to cast, it's used for making conduits for water. When it's oxidized, it gives a red pigment. It can also give you a yellow pigment, and eventually it also gives you a white pigment, which has been the most important white for painting ever since. So you have this material which is plumbeo, dull, gray, but it also gives you the beautiful white in the lace colors of Rembrandt paintings.
The metal is cheap, plentiful, versatile, and therefore tempting. It can be the source of great human suffering when it's too close to us, in the paint on our walls or in our water. Lead poisoning can cause debilitating headaches, seizures, gastrointestinal problems, damage to the nervous system, pregnancy loss, and premature death. At high levels, it can wreak havoc on a community for generations. The quest to remove lead in modern times has been long and painful, as is evidenced by the years-long fights in Flint, Michigan, and the Navajo Nation. We're afraid of lead, and it makes sense to be. But maybe what we fear isn't the metal itself. Our quest to separate lead from silver spurred the birth of analytical chemistry, Marco says. And for centuries, we tried to turn lead into gold. Maybe what we should fear is the way that we use it, and we should be honest with ourselves about its power and its necessity.
Lead is misunderstood.
In addition to jade, feathers, and bone, in the Met's Oceania collection, you'll find the head of a Sumatran puppet with large, soft leaden eyes. It's made of a warm wood with intricately carved ears shaped like the scroll of a violin, and gold earrings in a spiky bisected hoop. Its lips are slightly parted, and its eyebrows give it an alert expression. It looks incredibly alive. This is the head of a cigale gale. These life-size puppets are carved to look human and dressed in ceremonial robes, loose ones to hide the strings. The one at the Met comes from Samosir, which is an island inside a lake inside the island of Sumatra.
Kenangan saya yang paling menakjubkan waktu masih kecil melihat si gale-gale bisa bergerak-gerak.
The most spectacular memory from my childhood was when I saw Sigale being able to move without electricity. So I thought that it was a magical attraction since there were no strings visible.
Karena tidak ada tali-tali yang kelihatan.
You just heard the voices of Jeffrey Simatapang and our translator, Kanya Rifatulzia. Jeffrey is an archaeologist with the North Sumatra Archaeology Center in Medan City. He grew up in Siantar, a small town in North Sumatra near Lake Toba. As a child, he'd go with his parents to Samosir and see the Sigale-Gale dance.
Dan tidak nampak manusia di belakangnya.
There was no one to be seen behind it. Therefore, we suspected that it moved on its own. The elders say it was animated by means of sorcery.
Manusia di sana bisa menggerak-gerakkannya begitu.
The puppet master who controls the Sigale-Gale is responsible for moving its arms, head, and body. It can dance at a funeral to mourn a loved one. The Sigale-Gale at the Met has space behind those leaded eyes for balls of moss that can be soaked in water, allowing the puppet to cry. Jeffrey's research on the Sigale-Gale explores its meaning in a historical context, starting with the legends behind it. Here's one of them.
Seorang raja, a big man, dia punya...
The king had a son who had passed away. He missed his son. Then he asked if there was anyone who could help console him. There was a shaman. As a master, he created Sigale-Gale out of a tree in the forest and placed a spirit inside it.
Sigale-Gale dari sebuah pohon di hutan, lalu dia masukkan.
The spirit was believed to be the spirit of the king's son who died on the battlefield.
Si anaknya yang tadi yang sudah meninggal, dia meninggal di medan perang. Nah, dia seorang raja begitu.
After the spirit had entered the puppet and it could move, the shaman gave it back to its father. The puppet looked just like his son, and the king was overjoyed to have his loved one back with him. But he couldn't keep his son with him all the time. The father could call for the spirit to return occasionally, but between visits, it was vital that the king send the Sigale-Gale away to the forest, where it could protect the village.
Tinggal bersama dengan sebuah patung yang ada rohnya.
Living with a puppet which held a spirit inside would have certainly affected his own psyche, his mental state. The spirit could enter the body of the father, unlike when he asked for them to meet, where he would not be possessed.
It was important that humans controlled the spirit, rather than the other way around. The carved vessel became a safe way of interacting with a loved one who had passed on, serving as a kind of physical receptacle for grief, one that had to be put away from time to time. But some of those vessels ended up a bit too far from home. Jeffrey says the Met Sigale-Gale is a beautiful specimen, and many similar specimens were removed from Indonesia by the colonial archaeology authorities. But now Jeffrey's job with the Indonesian Archaeology Office is to restore context to many objects which have been returned since the nation's independence from the Dutch. He says the Sigale-Gale myth matters to him because, due in part to all those removals, its original Batak meaning has been lost.
Saya menekankan terkait bukan soal horornya Sigale-Gale, tetapi bagaimana kerinduan atau hubungan.
I wish to emphasize not the horror of Sigale-Gale, but the longing for, or the relationship between humans and the world of the dead. I always wish to highlight how people in the present should not be afraid of the spirit world all the time. I love watching horror movies. To me, it is a delight. Right now we are alive, tomorrow we are dead. We should not let it turn into fear. This is very important for the next generation, that our ancestors had a good means to cherish the loving relationship they had. How we long to meet those that we haven't seen in a long time. After seeing each other, we hug and say goodbye, right? Then we meet again.
Selama ini tidak muncul, tetapi sudah kita rendu, kita berpelukan, kan selalu kita akan goodbye kan gitu, ketemu lagi kan begitu.
When you remove the puppet from its Batak context, it's easy to reduce Sigale-Gale to the Indonesian version of the Annabelle doll. But in a way, the idea of an object holding a portion of our loved one's spirit asks us to examine our own relationship with the dead and see that it's probably not so different.
Kalau saya secara pribadi, misalkan seperti saya, my father has died 2 years ago. I have many experience with him. Saya kumpulkan beberapa
I collected several things he liked that I have with me. And it doesn't mean that I wish to call upon his spirit, but I wish to always remember the memories I have with him through his belongings. That is my version of the story, since I was very close with my father. The message I receive here is, this is a medium, so find the things that you have special memories of together with your loved ones who have left this world. Reminisce about it by yourself, for it is impossible for others to feel it to the same extent you do. Maybe they can understand if we succeed in retelling it well enough.
Yang akan Anda ceritakan, mungkin bisa dapat dia kalau kita berhasil menceritakan dengan baik.
There's a beautiful message in the Sigale Gali. It creates a channel for us to turn toward our grief, feel it, and let it transform into something else. Maybe an experience of pain and loss looks different through those eyes of lead. Like death itself, the metal becomes less a thing to fear and more a conduit to understand the world differently, to find the fleeting brilliance in those gray skies. Lead can hold our heaviest memories. Tin helps make stories sing, and iron can be a place where stories start. But this next metal has often been used to record the stories we tell. Let me reintroduce you to copper as a pigment.
The first thing I think about with copper is its color and its reddish pink glow. It is something like the star. When you see the star Venus in the sky, it has a coppery glow to it.
Jana van Dyke reminds us that copper has been associated with the planet and goddess Venus since antiquity. This is partially due to its lustrous beauty. On the periodic table, copper is a transition metal, often in the process of becoming something else. Jana is a conservator of Islamic manuscripts in the Met's paper department, and copper's mutability keeps her busy.
There's an innate instability in copper, and that sort of unstable nature is what accounts for all of the transformations that we see in the works of art, because it's constantly affected more than probably any other material by the environment, by humidity and water and vapor in the air.
Verdigris is the bluish-green patina that forms on copper and brass. And malachite is a bright green mineral made of copper, hydrogen, and carbon. Once processed into pigment, these two metal-derived materials show up as an infinity of greens on the pages of the manuscripts Jana cares for.
I think of it as very alive. And even though it is considered an inorganic, it does have a very transmutable quality. It is something that can be polished, can corrode, and it is that corrosion product, actually, that is what's employed in the making of paints and pigments.
The metal is flexible and beautiful, found in nature in a form that looks like the fronds of a red fern or the roots of a tree. The Greeks started mining copper on the island of Cyprus, which they called Kupros, as early as 4000 BCE. And Jana tells us that in ancient Islamic texts, verdigris pigment is often used to draw copper-green lines around the margins of manuscripts. But the metal's unsettled nature leaves its mark on the manuscript she cares for, burning holes through the pages over centuries.
What happens in the degradation phases of copper green is that it has a detrimental effect. It has destructive, corrosive qualities on the paper. So quite often, especially at the edge of the spine, the paper is completely broken. So at the worst case scenario, you've got a completely broken text block. The whole manuscript is collapsed, inside these copper green rolled lines.
But one manuscript Yana works on doesn't have that problem. No expense was spared in its creation. It turns out that mixing the copper pigment with costly saffron produces a bright ink with the texture of wet sand. The vibrant green of the metal can be preserved without any of the damage it usually inflicts. So this book and its copper framework survived intact.
It's like the Persian version of the Iliad and the Odyssey. It is a great epic tale, and tale that starts in the mythic history, finally culminating in the collapse of the Sasanian Empire and the rise of the Islamic Caliphates. So it is a massive undertaking. It is a story of a people and how they imagine themselves throughout history.
Ali Alomi is professor of Middle East, Islamic, and Global Southern History at Penn State Abingdon. And he's talking about the masterpiece of the Persian poet Ferdowsi. That manuscript whose copper hasn't degraded is called the Shahnameh of Shah Tahmasp, and copper was integral to its creation in more ways than one.
Copper as a metal is malleable. It's one of the more malleable metals. It's one of the reasons why it's in so much of the ornamentation of the ancient world. It's in jewelry, it's in rings, in necklaces, and also in all sorts of mirrors, right? Because you can shine it very beautifully. Long before they had mirrors, they were looking into copper and looking at themselves through copper. And so that malleability, the ability to integrate, the ability to take on new form, is really at the heart of what Ferdowsi is trying to do.
Ali says there's also a malleability to Islam, and its goal is integration, beauty, and justice. Those values manifest in the calligraphy of ancient Islam and in the building of elaborate gardens. Shades of green were important, especially in ancient Islamic texts, because of green's association with freshness, lushness, and new life. And in keeping with this love of beauty, the Shahnameh at the Met is a feast for the eyes.
It's bedazzled and speckled with gold flakes around the margin. Every page, we've got columns of calligraphy, but for the most part, what we're showing on display are these full-scale illuminations. The detail in the patterning of textiles is unimaginable. And this manuscript is the deepest, darkest blue of lapis lazuli in ultramarine form you'll ever see in any work of art, any manuscript, any panel painting. It is the finest, richest, deepest blue your eyes are just bedazzled by this.
This rich, epic, gorgeous object lives in the Met. Or part of it does. More on that later. But it also lives in the hearts of folks of Persian descent around the world, including Ali.
I think my first earliest memory was probably around 5 years old or so. I remember very distinctly my mom reading me stories from the Shahnameh. But as I've asked my mom, she said she actually read the Shahnameh to me even while she was pregnant. She did two things. She would read letters from her family sent from the home, so she would read them out loud so that I would be familiar with the family members even though I hadn't met them yet. And she would read the Shahnameh because it was one of her favorite stories.
Now that Ali is a professor, he gets to bring the Shahnameh into the classroom.
So my favorite story, and the one that I actually also still teach to this very day, would have to be Rostam and his son. Mostly because as a kid, I thought it was just like the most tragic thing in the world. But you kind of like those stories as a kid, right?
Ali starts telling the tale, full of flourishes. Rostam is an ancient hero who's traveling around when he meets a princess named Tamina, who kidnaps his horse.
And she tells him, Tamina tells him that I'll give you back your horse, but you have to give me a child. And being the ancient world that it was, it seemed like a perfectly fair deal.
When Rostam leaves, he gives Tamina a talisman she can pass along to the child she conceives, a son, who Tamina names Sohrab. Eventually, Sohrab grows up and becomes the champion of his kingdom. Then his kingdom and Rostam's kingdom go to war, and Sohrab is living under the weight of a prophecy.
He will know his father's name, he will know that it's Rostam, but he doesn't know who he is. And so father and son, not knowing the other, will fight. And they will wrestle in a great epic wrestle that will make WWE go to shame. For days on end, these two grown men will strive against one another until Rostam finally throws down the young boy and defeats him. The young boy says, "My name is Sohrab, and my father Rostam will avenge me."
Rostam realizes he's killed his own son.
And in confirmation, the young boy reaches into his arm and pulls out the very amulet that Rostam had given his mother years and years earlier.
Ali says that's how the Shahnameh works. It's the story of kings, but also the story of people and their mistakes. These stories didn't come from nowhere. They began as folk tales. Ferdowsi was one in a line of people who collected the stories from many sources and turned them into verse. According to Ali and others, Ferdowsi's Shahnameh was a linguistic turning point in later Iranian nationalist projects. It served as a major influence on the Persian literary tradition. The cultural and political context of this work cannot be disentangled.
The Shahnameh, like many works of history during this time period, is explicitly written for the purposes of imperial propaganda. We are an empire over all other people. How do we know this? Because all of history has led up to this exact moment. Who gets to say what is true and what is not true is always an exercise in power.
This exercise in power shows up in today's art as well.
I think it's a very modern sensibility for us to imagine art as devoid of politics. When in much of world history, art always has a political context, right? Whether it's in the case of legitimizing some type of dynasty, behold the wealth that I have, behold the might that I have, look at this statue where I happen to look very handsome in, right? If there's one common thread from ancient history to modern history, is that all history is myth-making. It's about creating narratives. It's about telling the story of us.
And who gets to tell that story? Who stewards it for the future?
I do remember distinctly seeing a Shahnameh once in a museum with my mother, and you could see it. There was this very weird experience. She's like, "Oh, this is a story we tell. Do they want our copy?" She didn't quite understand why it was in this glass case, and so she's like, "Give them our copy. Why do they have that?" And so there's there is a tension there, and I don't have an answer on how to resolve that tension, but it's there.
You could argue that ownership of art is an exercise in power that's just as political as Ferdowsi's writing. In that way, the tension Ali speaks of is about this physical copy of the Shahnameh and about who has been in charge of its story. The Shahnameh at the Met is one of the most elaborate and ornate versions ever created. It was made for Shah Tahmasp, who ruled Iran during the 1500s. It was eventually gifted to the Ottoman Emperor Selim II. It disappeared at the end of the 1800s and resurfaced in Paris in 1903. It stayed in the Rothschild family until 1959. That's when the museum's future president, Arthur A. Houghton Jr., purchased it for a reported $400,000. He split the folios apart to make plates for publication, and once they had been pulled apart, those 759 folios were dispersed in donations and in sales to the four winds. How do we talk about that? In telling the story of this astoundingly beautiful object, it's impossible to overlook the way it got into the museum, behind that glass.
There is something quite beautiful about walking into a museum and finding art from all over the world. But there's a violence there. That plastic glass case is a violent separation. So this is the context we've got to look at. When we look at the Shahnameh in the museum, the continuation of empire is not a historical experience, but a lived one. And that's like taking your mom to a museum to see a piece of art that's part of her culture is part of that experience.
Art historian Sheila Blair says it's vital to grapple with this, even when a beautiful object has an ugly past. Like Ferdowsi's tales themselves, a piece of art doesn't stop when the artist sets their brush or chisel down. The story continues, with reverberations both within and outside of a museum's walls. The Met has digitized its folios. You can see them on the website and in our show notes. This manuscript has lived a long life. It's languished in unseen splendor in Ottoman libraries, played a large part in codifying the identity of an empire, and is now fragmented, but available to the world. After its 500 years of history, what's left for the Shahnameh to do?
What the Shahnameh continues to do, the work that it actually does, is it continues to tell us the story of us, right? Why is my mom, born in Kabul, raised in Afghanistan, now living in the United States, telling this little American boy the story of Rostam? Why was that essential? Because whether she consciously was aware of it or not, it was her way of saying, this is where we came from. This is who we are. But when I have kids, I know that I'm going to be reading them the Shahnameh. Because there's a sense of like, okay, well, who are we? Where grandmother comes from somewhere. That place is called Kabul, right? And Kabul has its own stories. It's a way of linking the past to the present, the collective to the individual, and the individual to the collective. You belong. Here was a woman who had fled war, the Cold War and the destruction of Afghanistan, fled it, came to the United States as a refugee, didn't speak the language, but the Shahnameh allowed her to connect to a place that she had lost. It allowed her to connect to a people she could no longer find. It allowed her to speak a language that she could no longer hear. And that is what the Shahnameh continues to do. Here was a refugee living in Washington, D.C. in America who was suddenly able, through the Shahnameh, to connect to something larger than herself. And these stories continue to do that.
I'm still thinking about a question that came up with Ted, the arms and armor conservator. My experience of the beauty of this manuscript has to coexist with the fact that it was severed, both literally and figuratively, from its original context. In this document, the copper pigment has remained intact. It's the manuscript itself that was pulled apart, not by time or by chemical reactions, but by choice. And yet, the magic remains. The metals we discuss today are in a constant state of evolution. They want to tarnish, to rust, to transform the objects they're part of. To truly understand metals, we have to ask the question, what stories do we tell through the things we shape? And how do they change? Next time, mercury, silver, and gold. I'm Camille Dungy, and this is Immaterial. Immaterial is produced by the Metropolitan Museum of Art and Magnificent Noise. This episode was produced by Ottawa Jimma Brimpong. Our production staff also includes Jesse Baker, Elise Blinner-Hassett, Eleanor Kagan, and Eric Newsom. And from the Metropolitan Museum, Sarah Wombold, Benjamin Corman, Rachel Smith, and Douglas Hegley. This season would not be possible without Sophie Anderson. Field production by Tanita Romani. Translation by Kanya Rifatulzia. Sound design by Ariana Martinez. Engineering by Ariana Martinez and Paul Schneider. This episode includes original music composed by Austin Fisher. Fact-checking by Christine Baird. The podcast is made possible by Dasha Sukova Niarchos. Additional support is provided by Bloomberg Philanthropies. This episode would not have been possible without Miriam Ekhtiar, Patty Cadby Burt Curator in the Department of Islamic Art, John Guy, Florence and Herbert Irving Curator of South and Southeast Asian Art, Edward Hunter, Armorer and Conservator in the Department of Arms and Armor, Marco Leona, David H. Koch Scientist in Charge in the Department of Conservation and Scientific Research, Maya Nuku, Evelyn A. J. Hall and John A. Freed Associate Curator for Oceanic Art in the Michael C. Rockefeller Wing, Vicki Perry, Conservator in the Department of Objects Conservation, Kinda Roth, Conservator in the Department of Objects Conservation, Marcus Sesko, Associate Curator of Asian Arms and Armor in the Department of Arms and Armor, Jason Soon, Brooke Russell Astor, Curator of Chinese Art in the Department of Asian Art, Pierre Turjanian, Arthur Oakes Sulzberger Curator in Charge in the Department of Arms and Armor, Jana van Dyck, Conservator in the Department of Paper Conservation. Special thanks to Sheila Blair, Lauren Johnson, and G. Willow Wilson. To see the fashion armor, those 2,000-year-old bells, and more, visit the Met's website at metmuseum.org. I'm Camille Dungy.